Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here at this event. The title that I think you received was The Future of the Middle Class. Perhaps a more provocative way to put it is, does the middle class have a future, at least in the United States? Our two speakers tonight are truly expert in trying to address that topic. One of them, my co-director of the Richman Center, Chris Mayer, is one of the nation's leading experts on real estate. It's finance, mortgage finance, securitization, and if you think that one of the main assets of the middle class, a signal of being in the middle class, is a home, and that the financial crisis that we have just seen was to some extent marked by the greatest increase of home ownership penetration, then the question of what the connection is between home ownership and the middle class is really an important one to address. And there's nobody better positioned to ask that, to answer that question than Chris, who is looked to as an expert by the congressional committees, by the media, and of course by his colleagues and students. The second person who can address the issues of the middle class is Andy Stern, the Ronald O. Perlman Senior Fellow at the Richman Center. He's better known for other things, I suspect. Former president of the SEIU, Service Employees International Union, which made him justly famous for his activities in trying to advance the cause of of employee interests and rights. He's played a very important role in public policy debate. For example, he was on the Simpson-Bowles Commission. And there's another way in which he's been a very important figure, and that is with respect to the healthcare debate. So he's written in the past books and other things about the importance of universal health care. But he played, I'm told by my Washington sources, a pivotal role in bridging the gap between the business side and the union side, and also the political side, in making the Affordable Health Care Act law. Not everybody thinks that's it came out in the best possible way, but nevertheless, there is this dramatic change in the availability of universal health care in the United States. And I think what's interesting about it is that Andy was able to frame it as a business case. So it wasn't just a matter of employees pushing, it was a matter of the business case. And so that, I think, gives him unique perspective on the question about the middle class. It's the way that business and employees are really in this together, and being able to understand that and to work the common set of interests, I think, is his really great strength as a leader and as a thought leader. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Chris, who's going to, I think, play Charlie Rose, at least for a bit. So, Chris.
Great. Thanks a lot. And I wanted to welcome all of you here this evening. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight. Certainly the role in the Richard Paul Richman Center as a co-director is a center that is all about taking on important public policy issues and thinking really about things that cut across a variety of constituencies. And it's really great for us to have alums both from the law school and the business school here tonight. So I wanted to welcome all of you first and foremost. Next, I wanted to kind of begin our conversation and say that when I first met Andy, the first question was, geez, we have this person who's been a very, very important figure in the public policy debate. But sort of wondered what would the role of somebody who has a background predominantly in unionization, predominantly as a leader of an industry that some might say is in significant decline. What kind of a role would Andy play both inside the business school and really as a thinker of important issues. And I've found, at least in meeting and talking with Andy, that I just continue to sit and am fascinated with some of our conversations. Hopefully you'll kind of take away some interesting thoughts from this evening. But I wanted to kind of start with that question. You know, we've a lot of attention in Wisconsin that started this, then in Ohio, the Chicago teachers strike. All of these are, you know, continued sort of questions about what the role of unions are. And I thought maybe we might begin by kind of getting some of your comments in terms of how that plays to the middle class, upward mobility, you know, global economy.
And first of all, thank you all for coming, and it's good to be here at the Richman Center with all of you. So let me just start by saying it's impossible to talk about any institution in the 21st century without, I'd say, placing us in a moment of time. So let me try to name this moment. This is a revolutionary moment, not a Cuban revolutionary moment or a Russian revolutionary moment, an economic revolutionary moment. And I say that because there's only been 3 economic revolutionary moments in world history. The first was the agricultural revolution. It was a 3,000-year transition. The second was the Industrial Revolution. It was a 300-year transition. This is the third revolution, the global, technological, finance, service. You can decide what you want to call it. History will. This is the third economic revolution in world history. One big difference. It's all going to happen in 30 years. So no single generation of people, and anybody who's in the business world understands this, have ever seen so much change in a single lifetime. You know, what we've seen in telecommunications, great companies like Eastman Kodak, only 25% of the companies that exist today will be economically relevant in 25 years. That's a theory that Joseph Schumpeter talked about in terms of creative destruction. So we are at a world where nothing that happened before is necessarily a great guide to what's going to happen going forward. Unions at times don't understand that this is not their father's and grandfather's economy. This is not a one job in a lifetime economy. My son, who's 26, will have 9 to 12 jobs by the time he's 35. So this is a revolutionary moment, right? And he is not unusual. So unions are finding themselves, you know, as is government, as our churches, our businesses, you know, swept away by the changes. And I think, you know, the situations in Chicago and Wisconsin are probably more ideological, political. But what's happening in the private sector a lot is, particularly in tradable goods, goods that are competing on a world economy, you know, people have to move really fast, make really big decisions, or they don't survive. And that is not necessarily where unions play their most positive role in sort of promoting change, promoting quality, promoting their employers, as opposed to living in the industrial world where we sort of fought everything.
So, I mean, it used to be in the industrial period, or maybe after we had antitrust laws in the industrial period, and, you know, rights for unions to get together, people had a perspective that, you know, the way to the middle class, even if you didn't have access to schooling, was to get a union job, to, you know, receive reasonable pay, some might say unreasonable pay, but negotiated pay, have a pension, and look forward to some kind of a life that clearly doesn't exist today in this world. What is the role of the middle class? What do people have to look forward to in that?
So, I mean, it's important to understand this country made a different decision than other countries about how it was going to distribute success. I know redistribution in the political campaign has become a very popular discussion in the last 36 hours. But there have been 3 ways we distributed success or hard work in America. One was the market, and the market worked a lot better in a national economy than in a global economy because it was distributing within a nation state and not internationally. So the market works still, but much more internationally than nationally. As we like to say, a rising tide used to raise all boats, and now it's just the luxury liners, and the rest of the boats are sinking in America. You know, the second way we used to distribute wealth was the government. You know, whether it's tax policy, whether it's housing policy, you know, we found ways to redistribute success. And the third was unions. And America made a conscious decision in the middle of the Industrial Revolution that rather than doing what European countries did, which is we were going to set national health care standards, national retirement standards, sort of more social democracy, America decided we were going to let employers and employees, through the Wagner Act, create collective bargaining would be the way we distributed success. That was a conscious decision. That's why we don't have the same kind of social democratic tradition. And it worked. If you said you had a union job when I was growing up, everybody knew what you meant. You could own a home, raise a family, live the American dream, whether you had a college education or not, because unions functioned in a national economy to distribute success. And the problem now is that unions have to function differently, just like business has to function differently. One might argue we should have international unions, not national unions for international employers, and some of us have been involved at different times trying to do that. But we made a decision to have unions be a way to help create the middle class. And in the absence of unions, with a fickle government that can go back and forth between different ideologies about whether we trickle down or go from the middle class out, as the president now says, or whether or not the market could ever work again in a national way. It means we don't have a plan to create a middle class. And I would just say, if we do nothing, the middle class will just continue to erode. There is nothing logical in the way the world economy currently works that will recreate a middle class in America without what Andy Grove called a more job-centric, distribution-centric America.
So some people would sort of, having spent some time in Scandinavia and in Northern Europe, some people would sort of look at those economies and say that, they're creating good jobs for their population. Why do we need either unionization? Why is it that globalization, Germany, and, why can't we function a little bit more like those economies without necessarily the social safety net, but the ways that they're sort of building and growing their economies?
Well, because they just have a different philosophy, because they do have a social safety. They've decided that people to go to work shouldn't be poor. And as we were talking about last night, America has a very progressive tax system that it spends very regressively. Europe has a very regressive tax system, value-added taxes and other things that they spend very progressively. So Europe has universal health care in most countries, universal retirement in most countries, child care benefits, lower college costs. They've decided to use a regressive system to create progressive things. So I think it's impossible to imagine having a Scandinavian system without a floor that's much higher than us, one. Two, I would say that, what Scandinavia believes, which is what is missing in America, is that if people don't have money to spend, the economy doesn't go anywhere. I mean, our problem now, and we'll talk about it in a second with housing, is the way people stayed ahead in the last 15 or 20 years is they had a second income in their family. They used the equity in their home. They ran up their credit cards. They took out loans for college. If they didn't have home equity, we just used leverage to fuel the economy. Other people are using wage increases to fuel the economy. And so you don't need unions, but you sure need people with more money in their pocket and a higher safety net, or you're not going to have a middle class in this country.
Maybe we could talk a little more about the taxation. We did a panel last night that Jesse Green organized. Jesse's here as well as a executive in residence, former senior executive at IBM, et cetera, who's also here from the Richman Center. And the panel talked a lot about the role of taxation in what kind of tax reforms we have, and just the idea of how do we, is the tax system something that's contributing to our problems, or is the tax system, is there real hope in that regard? So I wonder, coming from as a member of the Simpson-Bowles or Bowles-Simpson Commission, depending on your party affiliation, maybe you can sort of comment a little bit about sort of how those discussions played out, particularly relative to these issues of the middle class and redistribution.
So I say everybody agrees that we have the least competitive, most complicated, most ridiculous tax system in the world. At every level, no matter what you think should be done to fix it, no one defends it. That we do what I think Erskine Bowles named appropriately, that was maybe the biggest contribution to moving towards a resolution, is that we spend through the tax code. The mortgage interest deduction, charitable contributions is just a different way to spend money that comes into the government and give it back to a group of people for certain purposes. And when he finally said that, Then the conservatives thought, oh, if we cut that, we're cutting spending, we're not messing with taxes, so all of a sudden we're having a more fruitful conversation by changing the words, even though the concept hadn't changed. I think everybody privately said, including Paul Ryan, that America has to move to a consumption tax. We can't really get the revenue we need or the fairness we want simply through income taxes. We are the only developed country in the world that doesn't have a value-added goods and service tax. I think there's one Eastern European and 3 African countries that don't have value-added taxes. You could have a carbon tax, which is a consumption tax. You could have what's called a Tobin or a financial transaction. Some call it the Robin Hood tax, which is the tax financial transactions. There are many consumption taxes you could use. We are not going to solve America's problem with an income tax, and particularly with an income tax that has so many loopholes, and we don't count capital gains and carried interest and dividends as regular income. We sort of have to redo this whole thing, but one of the things we need to do is figure out a different source of revenue than keep taxing income.
How do you, well, I guess I'll ask 2 questions. One of them, is there any, in a global world, one of the criticisms of of having a stronger progressive tax system, the idea of kind of taxing the rich as our IQ squared debate will talk about next month, one of the sort of challenges is the idea that those rich are mobile. And so how do you have a more sort of level tax system, or even a system that generates additional revenue, if the wealthy basically can go to different countries, move themselves, locate in some Caribbean island or somewhere else around the world? Is it even feasible to have some kind of redistribution through the tax system?
Well, first of all, there's sort of a moral financial question. The problem with sort of all the focus on taxing the rich is there's not enough money. There are a lot of rich people and they have a lot of money, but compared to the number of other people in America and the amount of wealth that exists. So I'm for it to a certain extent, but it's sort of a dead-end street. 2 is I don't think the problem is not people moving out of the country, it's moving their money into the Grand Cayman Islands and Switzerland. So we have a different problem, which is the money seeps out and intellectual property gets moved around the world by corporations to lower tax. So our tax system doesn't prevent the leakage, and we need to do that. And 3 is the nice thing, which no one appreciates as much in this country because we've never had a VAT tax, is a VAT tax taxes imports but doesn't tax exports, because you put the tax on goods that come into the country. Many countries fund their social safety net by VAT taxes, taxing imports into the country, and you let the exports out for free, which actually gives you a competitive advantage. So it's a good competitive tax as opposed to a better tax in terms of having less loopholes and less problems in collecting it.
I should probably explain what a VAT or a value-added tax is. Think of it as kind of a national sales tax where businesses get a deduction for cost of goods or other inputs they put into the business. So in essence, and in many places in Europe, it doesn't show up the way we charge the sales tax, which is as an add-on to what's charged. Typically businesses are required to build that into the prices, so when you travel you may not see that you're paying a value-added tax. And typical rate's what, 15%?
Mm-hmm. And so, anybody who's traveled, you have that VAT tax, and sometimes you can get a refund when you leave the airport. But this is where the business and the law schools could have a difference of opinion, because a VAT tax actually taxes services as well. And we don't really have national sales tax on architects or legal services. So if the business people want to lower their taxes, they need a VAT tax, because then we'll get all those services into the tax base.
Right. The flip side being that a VAT tax, because it's so broad and covers a very large base of goods and services, allows for much lower tax rates.
That's right.
And so one of the appeals that some people think about a VAT tax is actually that it taxes so much, which I guess has been a criticism of it among some conservatives.
Yeah. But Michael Gratz, who's a professor in the law school here, is probably the leading expert on value-added tax. You should be very proud of him. And he has a plan that has been completely vetted and scored by congressional offices, that if you had a 12.6% VAT tax in America, you could get rid of income taxes for 150 million people completely. You would have a $100,000 deduction for all of you in the room. You would lower the corporate income tax to 26%, and you would take 150 million people out of the tax pay just by having a 12.6% VAT. Nice thing about a VAT is you choose whether you consume or not. So you can actually adjust your own tax rate.
Yeah. In this room, that might not take very many people out of the tax code, certainly not living in New York. But it certainly would have some effects. Do you see, I mean, you sat in a lot of political conversations. You know, many people argue that the fiscal cliff is going to be the thing that brings people together. What's your sort of, that's going to force action, which is, in theory at least, why Congress kicked the can down the road, although maybe it was after the election.
Yeah, I like to say that the fiscal cliff is as if we decided to empower a suicide bomber and we loaded the person up with enough dynamite to blow up the entire economy, which is what's going to happen if we don't do anything, and then say, well, we really don't want to blow up the whole economy, so we're going to sort of detonate, not let it detonate. And the truth is, what is beginning to happen in Washington is people are trying to figure out what I like to say is Washington's second favorite answer to all problems. If you don't get your way, the second answer is do nothing.
This is, by the way, I have 3 kids. That's their view also. Uniformly, so, if I don't get it, I don't want my sisters to have it.
So do nothing will look like this, because you have to do something. It's less continue all the taxes, less raise the debt ceiling, the progressives will get a certain amount of income from somewhere, right, as kind of their pound of flesh, and we'll defuse the bomb in 6 months. Because we always think that 6 months from now life will be better, which is how we have a $16 trillion deficit right now.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a lot of us are holding out hope that somehow there's going to be some point of commonality. Do you see anything that, recognizing that kick the can down the road is always easy, do you see some points of commonality that will have a substantive effect? Many of the things people talk about, if you just add up the numbers, as you say, they don't, even extending the Bush tax cuts just don't get enough revenue to fix the problem as much as one wouldn't hear that in the press. Are there enough things of commonality you think will address this?
Yeah, I think there's been a group, they call themselves the Gang of Six, which have been 6 senators from Dick Durbin to Tom Coburn, so it's, they've organized a lot of people, there's a lot of commonality, but we always, can find our differences, and, sadly the House of Representatives, which had people like Paul Ryan who were very thoughtful about the budget for a long period of time, have become very ideological, and this is not an issue you can solve through ideology. No one's going to win this fight by getting their way. This is about making a deal, and the question only is, do people have the courage to make a deal? Simpson Bowles got close. 11 out of 18 people were willing to do it. Behind the scenes, it was very close to getting 14 out of 18, which would have been enough to get it done. So I think there is a lot of coming together, but there is a question about leadership. And what I have said to the business community is what made healthcare work, whether you like it or not, was that Walmart, Intel, AT&T, people in the private equity world, pharma, all came together and said the status quo is not going to work. So we're going to try to do something. What they decided to do, we all can argue about, but they understood doing nothing was not an answer. That has not yet. That is just beginning to happen in the business community. Dave Cody from Honeywell and others have put together a group. They're looking to sort of build a broader coalition because Washington needs cover to make tough decisions, and I think that is being built, but it's been missing up until now. Now I want to ask you a question, though. So you know a lot about housing. How owning a house has sort of been part of the American dream. Sort of where are we on housing in the middle class right now?
I think in the same kind of observations you've made about the erosion of the middle class, housing has always been one of the places that I think most Americans could look forward to as a way of accumulating assets, even without 401k plans, even with issues about Social Security. If you look at people, if you look at the elderly, over the lifetime, probably about 85% of Americans will at one point or another own their own home. At some point in their life. When you look at people at retirement, those 85% of people have assets to bring to the table to fund retirement. To start, the bulk of them, although fewer all the time, actually it paid off the mortgage. And so if you had, the single best advice for people to live, to live a fulfilling life and retire was to buy a home, pay off your mortgage, and when you hit retirement, you have a place to live. And when you needed to move out of your home, it kind of served a little bit like long-term care insurance, which is if any of you are at the point where either with you or your parents are hitting the need to move into a long-term care facility, they'll just take your home, and for the most part, you can choose a facility to be in. They'll convert you over to Medicaid. The 15% that are non-homeowners, all of us in the room are basically paying for their retirement. We're paying for it through Medicaid, we're paying for it through Medicare and Social Security, and those folks, and in some cases welfare, for people who really face, they're elderly who still enter the welfare system. And so when you look at the combination of these problems, owning a home was always a mechanism of upward mobility. If you look in developing countries, another sort of interesting feature is that people view home ownership as stability. There are basically only two things you need in life, which is food and shelter, and healthcare comes in somewhere there as well. And in economies, the more uncertain the economy, the more important home ownership is for people who are living in developing countries. So in that sense, I think the challenge of home ownership is one that really is, I think, playing a critical role in how people in the middle class think about their own welfare.
And so do you see the trend that less people will have, that 30 years from now, instead of 15% of the population not owning a home, that we're going to really keep expanding that, or is this just a sort of constant change?
Well, I think it's a good question where we're going to be, and I think this is a place where the public debate really, really misses a lot about home ownership. For starters, a lot of it, people talk about this as being about the community and a community of homeowners. There's not a lot of academic evidence for that, but there's sure a lot of academic evidence that saving in your home plays an incredibly important role in your welfare later on in life, in many ways. But if you look at the peak of home ownership rate in this country, I could ask people what year in the last decade it was, and I suspect many people would look and say, well, 2007, of course, when we had all these subprime loans. Actually, it peaked in 2004. As the subprime crisis, as I've written a lot about, as we had no money down loans, the median down payment for a subprime loan was 0. From 2005 to 2007, the home ownership rate was actually declining in the country.
And why is that?
Because people, a lot of the homes that were purchased over that period were speculators, not homeowners. Homeowners actually in some ways couldn't afford to get into the housing market in many places because people who wanted to sort of more sustainably get into properties couldn't do it. And so you actually saw foreclosure rates rising even while the unemployment rate was falling in the country, because a lot of the housing bubble, and we'll continue, I've done a lot of writing on this, but we'll see more and more it was about speculation by lenders, speculation by securitizers, speculation by global institutions, and speculation by individuals who are buying properties with the view they wanted it to go up forever. And so one sort of thing is people kind of associate home ownership with instability, when the reality is home ownership is really associated with stability, particularly when we actually have a down payment. The other thing which I'd sort of point to that's a really big misnomer is most people think of, and I think you probably saw this in a very different way from the Simpson-Bowles perspective. The mortgage interest deduction is typically sort of thought of as a subsidy to home ownership. It's actually nothing of the sort. The mortgage interest deduction is a subsidy for upper middle class homeowners whose income is at a point where they don't get hit by the AMT so badly. But people, because the tax benefit is bigger, the higher your mortgage amount, and the tax benefit is bigger, the higher your marginal tax rate. And so the vast majority of the dollars are actually not for first-time home buyers. They're actually going to people who are building larger, more expensive homes, and they're being subsidized appreciably through the mortgage interest deduction. So if you look at the U.S., the U.S.'s one of the few countries that has a mortgage interest deduction, but our home ownership rate is not higher than other countries. Actually, it's slightly below the OECD average at this point, as we're sort of shrinking down. So we haven't really done a very good job at all of subsidizing home ownership, but we have done a very good job of subsidizing through the tax code people who, you know, I think sort of view owning a home as something that is kind of an entitlement, but it isn't something that is affecting the kind of folks that you were talking about. Many of them don't itemize.
So last question before we go to the audience. So if you believe home ownership is enormously important for stability and in the end of life for people to live sort of a decent retirement, what does one do to rebuild home ownership for the middle class?
I think we should think a lot about programs that link savings to becoming a homeowner. Because I do think home ownership brings stability. I think of it as something that is in all of our interests as taxpayers, because if people haven't built the safety net and the savings, we as taxpayers are going to have to pay for that safety net at some point or other. And that is, you know, the projections of that through Medicaid and Medicare are actually going to bankrupt the government. And so housing is the easiest way to actually encourage savings. One of the interesting facts is you can look at data and see somebody who's 28 years old and going to be a homeowner next year because their savings rate goes from basically negative to 15 or 20%. That was when we required down payments. So I think if we had programs that looked at 401k type programs that gave tax deferral or even tax elimination to people who are lower middle income people who are putting money into savings as long as they use it towards the down payment of a home. And we pay for that through a reduction in either the limit of the mortgage interest deduction, we kind of phase it out over time. I'm a big fan of eventually getting rid of it entirely as Simpson-Bowles, or at least one of the options in Simpson-Bowles or Bowles-Simpson did. There's a lot of resources there that would help protect property values with a longer phase out, and would focus the resources we have towards having people who are at the lower end of the income distribution, encouraging them to save, and encouraging them to have a more stable existence, which I think would help, would serve the dual purposes of both trying to help with the government's deficit as well as from a social perspective trying to, you know, to generate stability.
There's been discussion in the news about the fact that 47% don't pay income tax. So I wonder how that figure intersects with tonight's discussion about the middle class.
I mean, I've heard the discussion. I think there was a video actually about this. You know, I'd say, you know, first of all, people pay wage taxes. You did say income tax, so I just want to say that because some people want to say people aren't paying taxes. You know, we've decided to fund our Social Security system through a payroll tax as opposed to an income or VAT or other tax. So there is people that pay taxes. Two is, you know, it is a combination of making a decision as a country that we want to keep cutting taxes, and therefore you keep cutting taxes. Eventually, you keep lowering the number of people that pay taxes, and it seems like in order to get rich people's taxes down, you have to get everybody's taxes down, so we keep shrinking the number of people in the tax base. And then we made a decision, I would say, because the private sector has failed at producing wages, we've created the Earned Income Tax Credit to sort of top up people, because our country has a moral value, you're supposed to work, and if you work, you get ahead. Problem is too many people are working and not getting ahead, so we created the Earned Income Tax Credit as opposed to many we could have created universal healthcare, universal retirement, universal home ownership, but we created an Earned Income Tax Credit to probably mask the fact, you know, that people aren't making enough money through the private sector market system, so government is now stepping in where the private sector has failed.
I would also observe that it's very hard to look at the tax system at a moment in time as opposed to a lifetime perspective. So if you look at people who look like they're dependent by collecting Social Security or on Medicare and are currently not earning income, over a lifetime, those people, the vast, vast majority of them were in the tax system at some point. And so I think one of the things that's important in any of this debate is to look at sort of lifetime incidents as opposed to incidents at any one point in time. And I think one would get a bit of a different perspective in thinking about those set of issues a little more nuanced, which I think would be, I guess, nuances in this political environment are lost on are lost. But as a professor, I still at least think about with my students trying to understand nuances of issues.
Executive in Residence, Jessica Green.
Gentlemen, can you comment on the role of education in the preservation of the middle class? We've had such debates around the education system in this country, and a lot of efforts being made to try to improve it. But the question is, can it really be accomplished, and can it really help the middle class regain some of its prior stature?
So I'm used to saying unpopular things. I'm going to say at least 2 or 3 unpopular things. Innovation is not the answer to bringing back the middle class. I say, if you don't believe that, look at the largest market cap company in the history of the world, Apple, that its retail employees produce $430,000 of sales each and make $12 an hour. So if innovation works, please don't give me too much more of it, because all those college kids are still going to be poor. 2 is education. It's enormously important for individuals. There's an enormous gap of skills for 1 million or 2 million jobs. We need 16 million jobs. And so, education is not the answer. If everyone had a college education, we had the same number of people graduating college as we did. There's 2 million jobs that we need to fill. Most of the growth is in jobs that don't require a college education. Childcare, healthcare, retail. Where you look at the job growth, home healthcare aides are non. So it is pablum, not for individuals, but for the country's economy to say, let's just have more innovation, let's just have more education, because that's going to solve the problem. It's like everybody saying we're for Simpson bowls, except when it gets to the details.
So I will take a point of disagreement with you, Andy, which is to say, I do think that the debate about education certainly shouldn't be the one-sided, everybody goes to a 4-year college and we have to think harder about how we're bringing people for the kinds of skills. But I also think that the role of innovation, I do believe enough in kind of the supply side of this to believe that if we had more people with more skills, we would start more businesses and we would do more successful things in the country. So I do think education is really an important factor. I also think it's important because the sort of whole issue of upward mobility, which is particularly important that people can aspire to being successful, that it's really important in our society for a broad cross-section of people to believe that. And oddly enough, even though in some ways it seems like that's going up, it's actually been declining over time, which is the ability of people to, from disadvantaged backgrounds, to pull themselves up as much as one finds a few sort of examples. The data suggest otherwise, and it's really because of the huge growth in the middle and upper class households investing in their children. And a lot of that investment occurs at home, and all of us understand how much time and energy and effort we put into our kids. But in an odd way, the fact that we want our kids to be successful and have the resources to do it, and it puts a lot of pressure on the educational system to try and counteract that. And so I do think we have to, one way or another, worry that there are opportunities for everybody to kind of pull themselves up, and that is one of the risks of the failures of our education system. Even if it turns out that only X% of those people can do it, it's really important that that access be, and that ability be spread in some way that people can feel like they have their chance.
Excuse me, I'm concerned about your son. He's going to have 10 jobs over a dozen years or so. How is the society going to train him? How can he move from one job to another? I don't understand that connection.
That is the way people get the idea used to be, you got a job, the employer managed your health care, the employer managed your retirement, the employer managed your training, the employer managed your promotion, and then you got a watch and you went home. Now the way you do it, and look at lawyers. My father was a lawyer. He practiced in the same firm his whole life. People now break up, split up, get remarried, start their own firm. I mean, people manage their work life in a way by going from job to job to look for better opportunities, and they see each job as part of their career training, as opposed to staying in the job and getting their career training. So the mobility is how we're doing the training. You know, one could argue why that's happening, but that is how younger lawyers or younger people like my son see their future, is job to job, each one being a little bit higher, learning another skill and figuring out what they're doing. The problem is our healthcare and our retirement system is totally unprepared for kids like him to have any kind of continuity.
Chris, you talked about a phase out of the mortgage interest deduction, and I want to try to link two concepts together. One, regardless of how you kind of phase that out, wouldn't that essentially be a huge, very drastic cut in the wealth of a lot of homeowners? And I'm not sure. I mean, you can talk about how the ripple effect that may have. And I want to also kind of tie that into the fact that with the ready availability historically of student loans, hasn't that kind of tied into the current cost, as you said, that you like, of what we have now for higher education, where a lot of people who many people who probably sitting in this room who went to colleges or graduate school now, those schools are probably 2, 3, 4 times as much, and the potential to send a child to the school that you went to as an undergraduate may be realistic.
Right. So I am actually, despite my earlier comments, very sympathetic on the issue of tuition. I think it's a hard problem, both as somebody who was dean of the faculty of the business school for several years and saw on one hand the challenges of ever escalating salaries and competition for the very best faculty, and so felt that this was something that was really important for us to continue to do as a leading business school, faced on the other end by students who are really struggling to come and to make it. And you know, there is a redistribution system built into the college system as well. So Ivy League schools like Columbia, certainly for undergraduates, have brought the floor up a lot for people who don't need to take out debt at all. So in a sense, college tuition increases at the top are masking what is also redistribution that's built into our tuition system. We can argue about whether that's good or bad, or whether we should go to a European system. Personally, I think, you know, U.S. universities are still one of the great, you know, one of our great treasures in this country. I think a lot of our innovation, a lot of the other things, a lot of the wealth that we have that's created is driven by our university system. You don't have to look further than New York, Boston, and San Francisco to make that case in spades. So I do think that nonetheless the issue of tuition is a real, you know, is a real significant one. I don't have great solutions for that, but you could make a compelling case. The government support for student loans has played a role in that, although I would argue that the for-profit system is a significant part of the problem, which is if you threw the defaults out there, the student loans wouldn't be as expensive. Maybe that would just mean we raise our tuition further. But I don't think it's quite that straightforward. But there is a lot of competition for skilled workers, including faculty. On the housing side, the mortgage interest deduction, I'm very sympathetic to the view that there are two challenges to think about. One of them is the redistributive element of the mortgage interest deduction. And the other is, what does it do to housing prices? I think nobody thinks, no sensible economist thinks that we should get rid of the mortgage interest deduction tomorrow, because it would clearly have an effect on the housing market. The question is only how you phase it out, if of people who would like to do it, how long you phase it out, and how you do it. You know, you could initially take it from what it is now to a tax credit, or a refundable credit, so everybody is taxed at everybody gets the benefit at the same marginal tax rate. That would make it a little bit less of a system that favors kind of upper income taxpayers, and you could trade that off against lowering tax rates, for example, something that Simpson Bowles talked about. So if you think about this in a revenue neutral sense, you can have offsetting benefits to people who are involved in this. The other thing is just population growth. which is one of the things that happens over time is the U.S. population grows about 1% a year. What that means is that if you have a phase out over a long enough period of time, the reduction in demand by existing homeowners is offset by population growth that adds more people who want to live in those homes. So I don't think it has to be something that trashes home prices. I don't know if that's a technical term, but it doesn't have to be done in a way that has a negative effect on house prices, and I think we should be cognizant of the benefits and the trade-offs of this as well. My concern is mostly that it's a very, very, it's a $100 billion item. And so if we want to think seriously that we're going to more equalized tax rates or go to a system, I'm a big fan of value-added tax or consumption system like most economists are, all those systems tax everything. And so housing, there would be no mortgage interest deduction at all in that. And I think the rest of the world has some good ideas in some of this. I think, how to trade those things off, I think, has to happen over time and is part of a broader package. You can't isolate it in one time. And obviously for people in New York, probably many people in this room, that would be it would be a negative. But I think a more efficient, better, balanced tax system would more than offset it.
Yeah, but you sort of answered part of my question, which had to do with income taxes. I have a fairly moderate or modest income, but yet my return is more than 100 pages of nonsense and schedules, and take this number from page 86, line 27. It's ridiculous. In fact, I look at it for the amount of tax I pay, and I mean, I'm astonished at how stupid the whole thing is. If you go to Wikipedia, you can see a copy of the original tax return when it was done back in 1913. It's a one-page return with, I think, 6 or 7 brackets. I think if I were to ask you what the impact would be of going to such a system, I think you've answered part of the question. That would be housing prices would tank. But what would be some of the other?
No, I definitely didn't.
Well, you said trash, right?
Well, I said it didn't need to be done in a way that housing prices were trash.
If you did it overnight, I agree. So
I
you
think
could phase it
that
out,
you
but-
can't. The problem is you can't. Any one thing you change doesn't allow you. This is one of these things where doing big change is easier than doing small change, because what Simpson Bowles said, the reason we have 86 pages is if you ever look how big the federal budget is, that's because they're spending money on all these programs. The tax system is spending money on charitable deductions and other things with AMTs and limits, and so it's just a complicated budget of spending in the tax code. The way what Simpson Bowles said, which is get rid of all of it, as a basic operating premise. If you get rid of all of it, you lower the rates to 8% up to $70,000, 14% up to $210,000, and I think 23% above $210,000. So all of a sudden your mortgage deduction loss is made up by your tax rate coming down. And then the simplification is what everybody says. The simplification will drive growth in and of itself, right? That people, Dave Cody was on the commission. He's the CEO of Honeywell, really good, smart guy. He said, I do not make a business decision without a tax lawyer in the room. Because everything I do is not about growth, it's about growth plus the tax benefit of doing it, and I try to look at both, what gives me a greater return, not just what's best for the company's growth. And so there are ways to change the tax system. The problem is, as we're saying, is if you just change mortgage interest deduction, don't change the rates, it has a huge implication, right? And so you have to really see this as a systemic change, but everybody agrees the complication is costing American competitiveness.
The other thing I would say is that if we end up in a second best world, which is we can't take on the individual system, but we at least take on the corporate system, presumably a lot of the pages in that system are about LLCs and partnerships and S-corps and all this stuff, which has these very complicated rules. And I think if we broaden the base of how we thought about corporate taxes and had brought down the rates a lot, and for those of you who are in real estate, and I have lots of good friends since I've run the real estate program, or who are in certain kinds of businesses, that sounds like anathema. But if we sort of broadened the base of the corporate system and made it much simpler and got rid of these S-corps and LLCs and had sort of unified treatment of corporations, we could eliminate an enormous amount of the complexity and bring down rates a very large amount, which from an international competitiveness perspective would help considerably, because the corporations for whom the corporations that compete globally, predominantly the ones that are paying the 35% rate, and they're the ones for whom that international competitiveness is a big issue. The corporations that are predominantly focused domestically, where competition is less of an issue, are much more likely to be kind of S corps and LLCs, et cetera. And so the competitive effect globally of that kind of a system would make the U.S. much more globally competitive. And I would hope we can go some way in that direction, even if we can't take on the individual system, as Andy talked about.
Real quick question. You mentioned the government, the market, and trade unions, or unions in general, in terms of redistribution of wealth. Could you talk about, as this country goes through the third revolution, how big the unions were as we industrialized, and how big they might be as we move forward in terms of their influence on all this redistribution?
Yeah, I mean, unions got to the point where they represented 1 in 3 workers in the private sector. But more importantly, which is hard for me to even remember, but there were times when people waited to see what General Motors' settlement was, or the auto worker, or the rubber workers, or steel workers was, because it sort of set a wage guideline that other employers felt like, oh, well, they got 3%, I'm supposed to pay 3%, because there was sort of a sense that there were national industries and large employers, and they set, and for competitive purposes, you sort of had to keep up, and if they were getting certain raises. So, you know, as opposed to the minimum wage being the only thing now that sort of sets any kind of national standard whatsoever. I mean, unions are going out of business in the private sector. I mean, they're down to 6.2%. The trend line is pretty clear. If they don't reinvent themselves, or we're going to have to find some other form of organization or some other form of distribution. I say, there are simple things you could do that have nothing to do with workers' organizations. Like right now, we have very stringent rules in pensions about discrimination testing. That the executives don't get a disproportionate share of pension and still get the tax break. That's the purpose. Not that they can't get it, but you can't get a tax break from the government and not provide, some similar type pension system for your own workers. And we don't do that for stock options, for instance. So what's going to happen is the countries, as I like to say, in the third revolution, countries are teams. Germany has a plan, Team Germany. Team China certainly has a plan. They steal technology, they limit foreign investment, they manipulate their currency. It's a plan. It works pretty well, actually, for them.
And they move into Africa.
Singapore has a plan, right? America thinks the market is a plan. It is not a plan. It is a failed 20th century plan that won't work in the third economic revolution. I know Glenn Hubbard and I don't always agree upon that particular issue. It just doesn't work. It's not like I have anything against the market. It works perfectly internationally. We're raising China, we're raising India, and we're lowering America. So America has to make a decision about how we're going to distribute success here.
We have time for 3 more questions, 1, 2, and 3.
By the way, just one quick observation on that, which is, I think whether, even without taking on that perspective, I think there are a lot of places we can agree that what we're doing at the moment puts us at a big competitive disadvantage. There are many, many policies that we have that could make this country more efficient, whether or not you believe in the market. In fact, if you believe in the market, the tax code we have is a terrible impediment to what we're doing.
My question is about the value-added tax and consumption taxes more generally. How should their proponents address 2 potentially powerful points of political opposition, which are 1, it's a tax on everything, and 2, that it's quite regressive in that poor people spend more of their income on consumption?
So Michael Gratz answered your second question in the 21st century way, which is based upon your income in the previous year, which is about all you can do. He loads up a debit card with tax deductions. And when you go to the store to buy things, you swipe your card until you run out of your appropriate level of deductions. So now you're into not the regressive side. And there's always a question of what goods and services is anything exempted. But there are ways with technology, like food stamps now are all on debit cards. There are ways to actually build a deduction right into the point of sale. You know, in terms of taxing everything, you don't have to tax everything. It's just, this is what happens in America. Once we start taxing one less thing, then everybody spends their life trying to get their thing included of what we don't tax, and then we have a distorted system. And so, you know, I think it's better to presume we're starting with everything. Obviously, food and medicine are, you know, important considerations. But I sort of like Michael Gratz's ideas. Let's load up lower income people with more deductions right at point of sale from the cost, and that way we can, you know, make it more progressive without filing papers.
I definitely think that the VAT, economists love your first point. Every economist, you know, will tell you that what you want to do is tax the broadest base possible at the lowest rates possible, because in general, higher rates discourage economic activity. And so the first point, I think, is one that almost all economists agree with. As soon as we start getting into the discussion of what's more elastic, what's less elastic, we prefer this consumption to that consumption, it becomes a mess. And so the political argument for this is that, you know, everybody loses their pet thing together. That political argument, of course, goes absolutely nowhere. But, you know, that's at least...
it does well in universities.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to add a footnote to the tax policy debate. There's a substantial literature in the law world that explains the complexity of the tax code really as a result of the way we finance elections in the United States. So basically, and there's literature on this, you look and you see who's on the tax writing committee, and you basically see the continuous activity of lobbyists to have this or that small change made to the tax code, which does essentially, it's a way of allocating expenditures. It's a way of giving a subsidy or maybe protecting or hurting a competitor. And so it's the complexity is a way to raise funds, because small, low visibility change are the stuff that political figures can use in the marketplace for raising political funds to trade back and forth. And as I say, there is a substantial literature that shows this in many, many cases. And so I dare say that part of the challenge to a broad sweeping move like Simpson-Bowles is facing head-on the dysfunction really not of the tax system, but of the political system which has created it and thrives because of the complexity.
So by the way, if you're on the committee that regulates Fannie and Freddie, your constituents get foreclosed on less too.
One
It's
last
actually
question.
documented.
I want to thank you both very much for speaking tonight. You talked about a couple of different competing interests, one being that your son is job hopping and will have, as it's been said, 10 jobs in the next 10 or so years. And then the reality that home ownership represents a certain level of stability. What if the new normal is renting? What if, and again, I know this has all been talked about tonight, but how do you see those two competing interests working out, and do you see one impacting the other? Will people stop taking new jobs and try to stay in one city, in one job, or do you see some other interest taking over that?
So you hit on probably the biggest argument on the other side of homeownership, which is the sort of transition issue of people moving jobs and moving locations. And to the extent that changing jobs becomes synonymous with changing locations, then homeownership certainly imposes significant risks on households, because if you have to sell at a time that the housing market is down, you may not be able to move from one place to another. And so in the short run, studies have found that owning a home, if you're going to be there less than 5 years, imposes more risk on households than renting. But when you go beyond 5 years, the risk flips, and actually owning a home is less risky, because of course as a renter you also face rental risk. Let me just give you a couple examples. I spent a bunch of time about 1.5 years ago advising a group of investors who were getting into the space of trying to be, buying single family homes. And the more I learned, the more I sort of became a little bit skeptical of this as more than a transitional solution to kind of our current set of problems. You know, if you look at rents in that space, homeowners are paying, depending on the location, 12 to 14% of home value in rents. Now, whatever you think the FHA should be doing for homeowner, you know, for homes, et cetera, you know, if you look at an FHA mortgage with 175 basis point spread or whatever you want to do, you know, those rates are at 5.5%. If you throw in property taxes and insurance, maybe you get up to about 7% of home value a year. And that's paying a really, really, really hefty premium to protect against default. Really, really big risk premium. And why the difference? Well, in part, if you're trying to manage a portfolio of single-family homes, you've got to do a lot to take care of those homes that the homeowners just do themselves and take for granted. And so if you have a lower middle income person, somehow you have this problem that they will just go fix the toilet themselves. But if you're a renter in that home, you're going to call a plumber to go fix the toilet. And it's a really inefficient way of managing things that lower income people would do for granted. They would spend a lot of time fixing up their homes, fixing up their basement, improving it. Everybody, anybody who's owned a home for very long understands how much stuff you do on your own. And it turns out that putting all of that into rent is relatively expensive on the rental side. And in addition to just the incentive to maintain the home and other things. So from a pure financial analytical perspective, it's a challenge, and I'd rather see us work to try and find ways to encourage people to save to get into homes so that they can be stable homeowners than a system that sort of has a lot of people renting, which is relatively inefficient for a variety of reasons. And I'm not even going to count the tax issues in here. I just think we're better off moving. That's what the market would do if we sort of had a reasonably functioning market. We just don't have a mortgage market, but that's because of policy. Government policies that have made it nearly impossible to have a mortgage market right now. It's not because that's anything like a market outcome.